Happy 4th of July weekend from the Yingle family, and welcome to St. Mark's Church Online. We hope you enjoy the service.
Baptism is a public reflection of your personal identification with the greatest act in history, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Baptism means we are publicly identifying with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. It is your personal testimony to, and the inward assurance of, your passage from the old life to a new life in Christ. Are you ready to be baptized? We can't wait to hear your story. We're currently working on the logistics for baptism this year, but rest assured that we will be following whatever recommended health and safety measures there are in place in late August. To register for our August 30th baptism at Lake Camac or to find out more, visit exploresmc.org/events. Attention families, SMC Kids' latest family fun kits are available for pickup at the SMC weekday preschool entrance. The kits are packed with interactive materials for the Secret Sauce Challenge, encouragement cards, Bible lessons for preschoolers and elementary-aged kids, and a whole lot of summer fun. Stop by SMC to pick up your kit. You don't want to miss out. Looking for a way to serve this summer? SMC is partnering with Positive Attitude Youth Center to build relationships with children in our community each Tuesday and Thursday morning from 9 a.m. to noon. This is an ongoing project throughout the summer. If you have a heart to make Jesus famous by developing positive, Christ-centered relationships with local children, we hope you'll sign up to serve as often as you can. You can find the sign up at exploresmc.org/events or contact Margaret Wooten, margaret@exploresmc.org with questions. We're so glad you decided to join us online at SMC today.
People come together, strangers, neighbors, our blood is one. Children of generations, of every nation, of kingdom come. Don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. Oh, take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Oh, 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 oh. Sing Jesus, Jesus, our redemption. Our salvation is in His blood. Jesus, light of heaven, friend forever, His kingdom come. Don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. Take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from.
Creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. All His children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace to God. His name is Jesus.
Swing wide, all you heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. All His children, clean hands, pure hearts. Welcome to St. Mark's Church. Thanks for joining us today. We just invite you to worship with us.
As we wait, seek your face. Come and make your throne upon our praise. Here in this place, have your way. The moment that we see you, we are changed. Show us your glory. Show us your glory. The wonder and surrender, we fall down. Show us your glory. Show us your glory. Let every burning heart be holy ground. Not by power, not by might, but only by the cross we come alive. Here we're undone, overcome by heaven's love revealed before our eyes. Show us your glory. Show us your glory. In wonder and surrender, we fall down. Show us your glory. Show us your glory. Let every burning heart be holy ground. Show us your glory. Show us your glory. In wonder and surrender, we fall down. Show us your glory. Show us your glory. Let every burning heart be holy ground. Chains fall, fear bound here now. Jesus, you change everything. Lives healed, hope found here now. Jesus, you change everything. Chains fall, fear bound here now. Jesus, you change everything. Lives healed, hope found here now. Jesus, you change everything. Jesus, you change
Chains fall.
Chains fall, fear bound here now. Jesus, you change everything. Lives healed, hope found here now. Jesus, you change everything.
Every now and then I just like to take a few moments and walk through the St. Mark's Church Cemetery. It was established in the early 1860s. The oldest marked grave that we've been able to identify is 1864. There are somewhere like a dozen, maybe 15 unmarked graves. It's one of the oldest cemeteries in Alamance County. Quite a few of the members of the original founder group of SMC and their descendants are buried here, certainly making this a sacred 4 acres in a lot of ways. I guess I knew at least a couple of hundred of the people who are laid to rest on this modest corner of the planet, many of whom did the work of ministry, side by side with me and each other for decades. I owe many of these people more than I could ever repay for their devotion, their service, their generosity shown to this church over many years. Occasionally I'll walk these grounds and I'm reminded of conversations, special projects we did together, leadership meetings, difficult ministry decisions we had to make, generosity demonstrated by so many of these people, study groups and potluck dinners, and even some struggles and disappointments that we shared. There were a lot of great moments, some broken hearts here. I sometimes imagine what some of these old-timers would think now if they could see what has become of their old church and this world. 2 former pastors of our church are buried among the hundreds and hundreds of patrons buried here, one of which became a pretty strong mentor for me. So many of the names carved into these pieces of stone bring back some of the best memories for me that you can imagine. These people endured wars and rumors of wars, seasons of scarcity and abundance. Many of them saw the Great Depression and the Great Recession, disease and broken relationships. They poured themselves into the generations coming behind them with the hopes that their lives could be better and more prosperous. These people dreamed and wondered and asked questions and worked hard and gave much. Cemeteries are places where we bid farewell to precious relatives, our spouses, our moms and dads, our children, and in a few cases, even our grandchildren. One generation after another of people devoted to making life just a little bit better as long as they're here. I've gathered with family members under a large funeral tent in every season of the year, somewhere on this space. We read a few words from the Scripture, say a prayer. We remind each other that the followers of Jesus, for those of us who love Jesus, these grounds represent only a temporary separation from the people that we have loved and lost. Jesus radically changed many of the lives of the people who are buried here. There are numbers inscribed on each stone that tell us how many years the person lived, but those numbers don't say a word about whether or not the person enjoyed real living or ever lived out their redemptive purpose. But they were all here, at least for a while, and we owe a debt to those who came before us. But there's another type of cemetery that's not represented by a piece of dedicated real estate. I call it a relational cemetery, a friendship graveyard, where there are people buried because, for many reasons, they decided they can no longer be friends. We're going to talk about that today in part 5 of our summer preaching series called Jesus Changes Everything. He certainly changed the lives of many of the people buried here. So today we're going to take a closer look at some of the friendships we bury and how Jesus can affect how we see some of those friendships and how we might be able to even mend some of them. Hey, thanks for being here.
Seems like all I could see was a struggle. ghost that lived in my past, bound up in shackles of all my failures, wondering how long is this gonna last. When you look at this prisoner and say to me, son, stop fighting the fight that's already been won, 'cause I am redeemed, you set me free. So I'll shake off these heavy chains, wipe away every stain, 'cause I'm not who I used to be. I am redeemed. All my life I've been called unworthy, named by the voice of my shame and regret. But when I hear you whisper, child, lift up your head, I remember, oh God, you're not done with me yet. I am redeemed, you set me free. So I'll shake off these heavy chains, wipe away every stain, 'cause I'm not who I used to be. I don't have to be the old man inside of me, 'cause his days are all dead and gone. Because I've got a new name, new life, I'm not the same. Help that will carry me home. I am redeemed, you set me free. So I'll shake off these heavy chains, wipe away every stain, 'cause I'm not who I used to be. I'm not who I used to be. I am redeemed, you set me free. So I'll shake off these heavy chains, wipe away every stain, 'cause I'm not who I used to be. Oh, I'm not who I used to be. Oh, I'm not who I used to be. I am redeemed. Thank God, redeemed.
Hey, everybody. Independence Day greetings to all of you and to a church that must be scattered in 1,000 places on this holiday weekend, maybe even more than that. Now, typically, y'all are gone someplace on the 4th of July, but maybe never as much as now. But you got to admit, scattered has a brand new definition in our lives these days because we got sheltering and physical distancing and so. But I have some great news for somebody. Today, we are going to go to one of the shortest but most powerful teachings of Jesus on how best to manage the relational cemeteries in our lives. And it's a strong and doable strategy. But let me pause a minute before we get started, because last week, if you tuned in, then you know that I had let's call it a minor wardrobe malfunction. I heard from quite a few of you. I would wish for everything that y'all would pay as much attention to the sermons and apply those as you would the way I'm dressed. So look, here we go. Just to be on the safe side, I'm going to do a full 360 to make sure that nothing is malfunctioning. So give me the thumbs up if everything looks okay. All right, well, take a look at this short video clip. This is from the 1986 World Series.
Little roller up along first, behind the bag. It gets through Buckner. Here comes Knight, and the Mets win it.
There's probably no player in Major League Baseball history whose career was defined more by one mistake than Bill Buckner. Bill spent 22 years in the major leagues, had a fabulous career, National League batting champion in 1980, All-Star in 81. But it was the fall of 1986. Buckner's Boston Red Sox team had a 3-2 World Series lead over the New York Mets. They were 1 out away from winning the World Series. In the top half of the 10th inning, Game 6, the Mets' Mookie Wilson hit an easy ground ball, as you saw in the video, to Buckner. He was playing first base, trickled through his legs. The Mets scored on the play to win Game 6. They went on to win Game 7 the next day to win the World Series. Buckner's mistake at a clutch moment catapulted him to one of the top of the sport's worst ever blunders and bloopers. In fact, after his retirement, he felt forced to leave the Boston area due to the rage of so many of the fans around him, and he retired in isolation out in Idaho. The hard feelings between Buckner and the Boston fans lasted for decades, but things began to change some when the Red Sox finally won the World Series in 2004 and then again in 2007. And the power of forgiveness was then on full display in 2008 when Buckner returned to Fenway Park to throw out the first pitch of the home opener. He received a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes and brought him to tears. Buckner said, "I'm a person of faith. It was the worst era of my baseball career, obviously. But it's life, and everybody has to deal with something. But there are a lot more important things in this life than baseball and costly mistakes in a game." Bill passed away just last year at the age of 69 from acute dementia. At his memorial service, his family said, "Our hearts are broken, but we are at peace knowing that he is in the arms of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and all is well." I'll tell you, I'll never forget another eventful holiday weekend, for me at least. It was Memorial Day weekend, 2012. On Friday morning of the weekend, I was out on a long bicycle ride with a friend, and we were only about 5 miles from home when I had an unavoidable accident, crashed really hard onto the pavement of the country road, landing on my left shoulder and my left arm. The pain was excruciating, so I couldn't ride. I phoned Susan. She came and met us, packed up my bike, and we headed toward home. On the way home, I texted my medical doctor, and he said, "Hey, look, I'm at home. Just swing by. Let me take a look." Well, because of the location of the intense pain, I was convinced that I had somehow just destroyed my shoulder. Although by this time, I'll tell you, my left elbow was bloody and about 10 times its original size. So he looked me over, determined that I didn't have anything that was broken, sent me on my way with a suggestion for a leave over the weekend. Call your orthopedic surgeon. I texted my ortho doctor. He was on a long holiday weekend at Smith Mountain Lake, but he told me, he said, "Look, come in first thing Tuesday morning, I'll check it out." Speaking of long weekends, oh boy, the pain was seriously distracting. I preached that Sunday, wore a long sleeve shirt to hide the swelling and the bruising, but I couldn't move my left arm. So I had to grab hold of the podium with my left hand like this, but I couldn't move it at all. I've actually gone back and taken a look at a couple of pieces of that sermon, and I can't believe that nobody said anything, because here I am, and I'm moving this arm, but this one is like stationary. When I got to the surgeon's office on Tuesday, he took a look, sent me straight to X-ray. In a few minutes, he came into the exam room, had my scan in his hand, and he said, "Did you say you preached on Sunday?" And then he said, "I'll tell you what, you are better than most." And he showed me the picture, and there was about a one-inch gap where my elbow used to be. And when I got a panicked look on my face, he said, "Hey, look, we're going to have to reattach those bones." And 3 days later, I was in surgery for pins and screws and wires. My shoulder was messed up, but at least it was intact. So just tough it out, he said, for a couple of months, and things should be they'll be good to go. That was his medical advice. Hey, by the way, I'm reminded in that story that if you really think you've got some broken, messed up stuff, don't go to your family doctor because, anyway. Do you ever wish that our fractured relationships could be wired back together? Just take some leave, tough it out, and all things could be as good as new. Well, this is part 5 of our summer preaching series called Jesus Changes Everything. And today we're going to talk about an issue that will speak to just about every single heart in our church, at least on some level. So let's take a closer look at relationships that tend to get fractured and sometimes shattered. Maybe lies were told. Somebody perhaps took something that belonged to you. Someone spreads rumors about you. We call that gossip, by the way. A business partner begins to steal from the company. An alcoholic refuses to face their challenges, and it starts to force distance and creates frustration and broken hearts. Could be 100 other things that can wedge their way into our relational world. What was at one time a love relationship or a great friendship, maybe a over-the-top good one, is broken. And shattered hearts are almost always the end result. Today we're going to look at one of the teachings of Jesus. It's not very hard to understand, but in real life, it takes everything we have to put it into practice. There are plenty of times in the New Testament of the Bible when Jesus is hanging out with his closest friends, his apprentices, students, disciples, apostles, future leaders of the Jesus movement. We call them various things. There are other times when a group of religious professionals show up and they start firing questions at Jesus, hoping to trip him up and maybe show some obvious holes in his teachings or even maybe heresy. In Matthew 18, Jesus is having a private conversation with his inner circle, the 12 students, the trainees, and his words are crucial and strategic. Jesus says, "If another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense." If someone in the faith community hurts you or does or says something that fractures the relationship, there's certain things you can do to get the relationship back on track. And there are other things you can do or say that can send that relationship just tail spinning toward the ditch. And who are those people in that faith community circle in our day? For example, when someone says, "Sure, I'm a Christian," it's not always easy to figure out what they mean. It could mean that their parents dedicated them when they were babies or had them baptized. Maybe they went through First Communion or attended confirmation classes during middle school. Perhaps they say a prayer at the dinner table, own at least one Bible, get misty eyes whenever "God Bless America" is sung at a sporting event. Maybe they believe that prayer should be reinserted in public schools. Some people say, "Well, I got married in a church, didn't I?" Their grandparents were church attenders. They went to Sunday school, vacation Bible school as a child, summer church camp as a teenager. Maybe they remember the time when they prayed to receive Jesus or raised their hand at the end of a service. There are thousands of people who claim that they are Christians for one or more of those reasons, but many of those people have zero interest in really doing what Jesus asked his followers to do. Some because, they really don't care, and some because they really don't know what Jesus said and what he required. Susan and I were in a restaurant last week. Really, I think it was the first time that we've been in a restaurant since the COVID-19. And our server said, hey, welcome, I'm Josh. I'm going to be serving you tonight. And pretty soon Ben will be over and he's helping me. Well, that was code language. That was Josh's way of saying Ben is an apprentice, a trainee, also known as a novice. Josh was really good, and Ben was watching closely. Jesus selected 12 apprentices, all rookies. And he knew that there was coming a day when these men would be front and center. They would be the central part of the movement. Becoming skilled practitioners was a big deal. Well, this series, Jesus Changes Everything, is designed to close the gap between what Jesus said and what he's asking us to do. And one of the things right near the top of his list of priorities was closing this chasm where there are fractured relationships. Jesus said, if a believer does or says something wrong, go and tell them in private when the two of you are alone. If they listen to you, you have won back that believer. Let me hit the fast forward button and push things ahead about 30 years after the public ministry of Jesus. Paul, the most prolific and effective missionary of the first century, maybe in the 2,000 years of Christian history. Paul was making his way throughout the Roman Empire, starting local Jesus communities in almost every city where he traveled. We know that Paul took several mission trips all around the rim of the Mediterranean Sea, establishing churches in a number of strategic Greek and Roman cities. Eventually, Paul is going to make his way to the city of Rome, the capital of the empire. And later, Paul would write a letter to the church leaders in Rome in what is probably his most pivotal and important of all of his correspondence, the book of Romans. Someone was in my office this week and was passionately seeking some answers to all the divisiveness in our world these days. And she said, Bob, if people would just do what's right. And that's the cry of the ages. It's the same thing that Paul echoed in his letter to the followers of Jesus in Rome. For example, look at this passage. Have you ever felt this way? Paul writes, the trouble is with me, for I am all too human, a slave to sin. Watch this language now. I don't really understand myself, he writes, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. But if I do what I don't want to do, it is sin in me that does it. I have discovered, he says, this principle of life, that when I want to do what is right, I inevitably do what is wrong. That's our sin nature. So with this nature inside of us disrupting everything, including our relationships, some of those relationships are going to wind up in a heap of destruction. And that's what Jesus was getting to in Matthew 18. So Paul writes, never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see that you are honorable. Now here's the key phrase. He writes in Romans 12, as far as it depends on you, do all that you can to live at peace with everyone. Don't let evil, that sin nature, don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. So let's take a close-up look at the priorities of reconciliation, because everybody knows, in spite of what Neil Sedaka is saying, when he said breaking up is hard to do, that making up is harder than that. And so Jesus says, if your fellow believer sins against you, go and tell them in private what they did wrong. So, the first principle of reconciliation, jot this down. The first principle of bridge building is that it always, always, always takes two. And in the beginning of the restoration, only two. Let me give you a visual. Here's how it works. So we have a couple of stools. There are always these two components. We got somebody has to repent, Somebody has to forgive. Repent means you do a 180. You were going in this direction, and you say, this is destructive, and you turn and go in the opposite direction. And it always starts, watch this now, it always starts with the two hardest words in the English language. You know what those are? I'm sorry. Followed by the 5 most difficult words in English. I'm sorry, I was wrong. So wherever you're watching from right now, I want you to say those words out loud, because some of you haven't heard yourself say those words in a long time, maybe years. So say it. I'm sorry, I was wrong. It's clear that reconciliation always means there are two. There are 2 chairs. We have a chance then to shine a bright light on whatever the issues are that have separated us. A second principle of reconciliation, write it down, is that it takes time. In Ephesians 5, Paul writes, be careful how you live, making the best use of your time. The wise use of time does not mean procrastinating and running in the opposite direction from whatever is broken, but facing, dealing with it, chair to chair, shining a bright light. Let me illustrate. In my first church, there were 2 brothers. They had not spoken to each other in 17 years, Wesley and Lewis. I cared about both. The only way I found out about the breakdown was when Wesley did not attend his niece's wedding. That would be Lewis's daughter. And so when I asked him, he told me the story. When their father passed away 17 years before, both said that their dad promised that they could have the tobacco stringer, which is, I had no clue what it was, which is a large piece of farm machinery. In fact, I got a chance to see that infamous stringer myself. Now, the crazy thing is that neither Wesley nor Lewis were farmers. In fact, that machine had been resting in a barn or a shelter of some kind. It had been sitting there peacefully with a cover over it for 17 years. Now, that is some serious procrastination. When Wesley showed me the machine, I thought, well, I'm going to try the old Solomon trick from the Old Testament. And I said, hey, look, why don't you and Lewis cut the thing in half and each of you could that didn't go over. Paul writes, look at this. Never take revenge, my friends, but instead, let God do that part. As much as we sometimes want to shake our finger and execute our brand of justice, it almost never works. So what did Jesus say? Go privately. He's saying, don't spread your poisonous frustration and your anger from one person to another, but go chair to chair in private, put a bright light, shine the light on what the issue is, and leave room for God to be God. And remember that God's redemptive plan overflowed from an old rugged cross with your name on it. So that's our model. It takes 2. It takes time. And here's a third and critically important principle of reconciliation. It takes wise boundaries. Let me explain that. Every healthy relationship has to have boundaries. When somebody violates our trust, we don't just foolishly give them access to our hearts so that they can just start walking on us. Paul writes again, Romans 12, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That includes reliable, wise boundaries. For instance, if you share something that I've told you with someone else, I told you in confidence, but you go talk about it, I'm going to be really careful about sharing anything that's sensitive in the future. Now, we can still be friends. I'm just going to be guarded. That's a wise boundary. There are parents across this community who will allow their teenagers to drink adult beverages so long as they do it in their own home. Hey, look, sign me up for some of that wisdom. Where's the boundary in that? Wherever you're quarantined on this Independence Day weekend, wherever you're watching this service, Look, just glance around especially if you've got some other people there, and you're going to see people. All the people you see in your room are people who have something broken inside. They all have flaws and faults and failures, and so do you. So Jesus said, begin with 2 chairs. And just between the 2 of you, what'd he say? Shine a bright light on the challenges. Give it time. Build some safe and redeeming boundaries where one or both of you might have stored up a whole bunch of yucky stuff. So he says, go privately. Point out the offense. If the other person listens and confesses it, you have won that person back. Let me ask a terribly naive question. Why does Jesus push the issue? Because he knows it's going to happen. In fact, it happens a lot, even in the Christian community. And Jesus also knew that relational sabotage is one of the primary strategies of our adversary. So Jesus says, select 2 chairs. And if you can win back the person, then we all become winners. And the movement, the Jesus movement, takes a giant step forward. Why would Jesus teach the 2 chairs theory? Because he knew that this strategy would not come natural to us. It's a counterintuitive plan. It's not something that we just do instinctively. So it has to be communicated, explained, and modeled. Jesus knew that it would be easier to talk about somebody than it is to sit and talk to them. He also knew about our sin nature, and that if we allow the relational pain to go underground, and if it starts to gain some momentum, chances are that somebody is going to grab a stick of notorious dynamite, and one of these days it's going to blow up. How many of us can think of a time when we had a relational meltdown, and when we paused long enough to think about it, we realized that it was something that might have happened months ago or even a year or 2 ago, and in some cases, maybe 17 years ago. Many of us who have been married for very long, we realize that sometimes the conflict that we're having is really not the fight that we're having. You know what I'm talking about. And if the 2 chairs plan is ignored long enough, one day that relational poison will come spewing out like a volcanic eruption. Jesus is teaching that it's best to take care of things sooner than later, so that the emotions that we have today don't become destructive tomorrow or next week or next year. Some of us know what it's like to put the brakes on the 2-chair plan, sidestepping the hard conversation. And then one day, somebody grabs a shovel and buries the friendship, breaking the heart of God. We live in a world, everybody, of broken and busted relationships. I'm not naive about that. Broken marriages and families are wearing down right before our eyes. I hear stories every week about relational isolation, where we push people away and isolate ourselves, and then we insulate. Isolation and insulation, which make forward progress close to impossible. It's not only families. Companies sometimes get neck deep in corporate politics, and before you know it, the company is on the verge of a destructive explosion from the inside out. We've probably never seen such a pandemic of anger-infused broken politics than in our day. It starts in Washington, D.C., stretches to Raleigh and to our own city and county. And so much of the divisiveness is caused by a complete meltdown of respectful conversations across partisan lines. When did our politicians throw away their chairs that were designed for conversation and compromise? But let's get real. And you already know this, but sometimes the chairs work and sometimes they don't. In fact, there are times when you reach for the searchlight and somebody immediately assumes a defensive posture. Just because Jesus prescribes this action plan doesn't mean it's going to work every time, and that's because the people sitting on those chairs are both damaged people, and they are deeply embedded with poisonous sins. Jesus knew that. Let's keep reading. Jesus said, "But if you are unsuccessful," that is, one chair to one chair, "take one or two others with you and go back again," which I'll illustrate that by, we'll add a third chair to the conversation. Jesus says, if at first this doesn't work, don't get frustrated and give up. Bring another believer, or maybe two, into the conversation. And now it's not just something that I see, but it's something that we see. Here's a verse. You put this on the refrigerator this week. I probably quote this verse in my office to someone every single week. Plans, this is Solomon in Proverbs 15. Plans go wrong for lack of advice. In the abundance of counselors, that would be multiple chairs, there is much wisdom. Adding another chair or two can be a great step toward forgiveness and reconciliation. And watch how Jesus illustrates his point with a surgical style story. Does anybody, besides me, because I've studied it this week, does anybody know what happened just before Jesus talked about the chairs? Look at what he said. Same chapter, Matthew 18. He says, "Hey, what do you think? If someone had 100 sheep and one of them wandered off, wouldn't he leave the 99 on the hillside and go in search for the one that wandered off? If he finds it," Jesus said, "I assure you that he is happier about having that one sheep than about the 99 who didn't wander off." Then he says, "In the same way, my Father doesn't want to lose one of these little ones." Now, Jesus didn't bring up the stray sheep story because he had a passion for sheep herding, but because he knew that we all have this reckless tendency to wander off and get lost. Now, I have exactly zero experience in shepherding a flock of sheep, but I have met one real sheep farmer, and here's the deal. Maybe you know this. Most animals have a built-in defense system. A deer can run really fast. Squirrels can climb trees. Porcupines have nasty quills. A bear has sharp teeth. Birds have claws. Turtles have a hard shell. A lamb? Basically nothing. Shepherds know that they either track down a stray lamb or that animal will wind up in a predator's lunchbox. So lamb rescues were super important because a stray sheep has exactly zero chance to survive. Maybe someone says something about you, lies about you, spreads a rumor that's not true, cheats you in a business deal, breaks a promise, sabotages a business agreement. You be the one, Jesus says, to go and seek out reconciliation, even if it's necessary to have 3 or 4 additional chairs. Oh, come on, Bob. Hey, look, it wasn't my idea. It's as hard for me as it is for any of you. I don't like it any more than you. For those of you who have children and teenagers, if you see a habit beginning to form and take shape, and you know this habit could become destructive in the years to come, those dead-end roads need to be faced and talked about. I know you've heard me say this many times, but the fact is, if you have kids, you are not raising children. You are raising the next generation of adults. There'll be a day when those kids will leave your house for the last time. Most kids leave somewhere between the age of 18 and 35. But quite frankly, many of those same adults, somewhere along the way, they get on that merry-go-round and they return to your place for a season or two. Recycling, I'm telling you, is not just for the unwanted cardboard and plastic in our house, but there will be a day when your children will leave and not come back. They will be unleashed into a world with many of the values and priorities that were built in our homes. Remember that the next time you apply some appropriate discipline when they're 6 or 10 or 14 or 17. For example, if you're raising a 12-year-old and you find them with their hand in the cookie jar where you put the out-to-eat money, this is a call for a serious conversation and some appropriate discipline and boundaries, because we don't want this 12-year-old transformed one day into a 30-year-old young adult who gets fired for stealing things from his employer. Maybe your teenage daughter lies to you about where she was or who she was with. The stakes are not that high when it's a white lie story that happens at home when she's 14. But someday, we don't want her to lie to her husband, her best friend, or the boss at work. It's a good time to remind that teenager that truth and trust are like the adhesives that hold a relationship together. And when trust is broken, it can lead to more trouble than they can ever imagine when they're 14. Once again, the focus is not that you lied about a curfew. It's a teenager, soon to be adult. They're in that critical formation season of life. We're not raising a bunch of kids. We're raising the next generation of adults. It's the story of a parent who goes after that stray kid. And I'll tell you, many of you know this, it's worth it. You know what's worse than a 15-year-old getting caught for shoplifting? Not getting caught. And deciding that, boy, that was easy. That worked like a charm until it doesn't. And then the teenager's is seen on a video, and a law enforcement officer shows up at the front door. Jesus says, when you realize that someone who's important to you is slipping over into the weeds or straying out into territory where there's danger, get a couple of chairs and start the conversation. Get out that bright light and shine that light on the problem. But what happens even when that doesn't work? Jesus said, you're going to need some more chairs. I've lost count the number of times that I've been invited to sit in on one of those difficult, painful, sensitive, critically important conversations. Look at verse 17. Jesus said, if they ignore the witnesses, then you tell it to the community of believers, the gathering, the assembly. In some translations even use church, the word church. Tell it to the church. If they also ignore the community, look at this now. He says, deal with them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Whoa, man. I mean, that sounds severe and abrasive. But remember that when Jesus said that, there was not one church on the planet. So the word that he uses here is the gathering, the assembly. Tell, if this doesn't work, tell your story to the gathering of believers. I don't think Jesus ever imagined that there would be a time when we would have a church full of people and somebody stands up front and makes the announcement and says, by the way, you need to know that Sam has been cheating on his expense account, or Sheila has been gossiping in her study groups, or Helen is having inappropriate conversations at work, and Thomas has been visiting dangerous websites. I don't think Jesus was thinking that. Hey, look, I've studied this passage for decades, and it's become more clear to me than ever that what Jesus was recommending is a gathering of the faithful for an intervention. How many times have I participated in interventions? And they are some of the toughest conversations that I've ever been a part of, but they've also been some of the most redeeming moments that I've ever seen. When a small group of Jesus followers huddles up with a person that they love, someone who's involved in some destructive lifestyle or some reckless decisions, and this group says, look, unless you face these issues and make a change, there's a train wreck coming. And this often leads to repentance and some forgiveness and life change. And come on, what's that worth? But look at these next words. Jesus said, if the person refuses to pay attention to the assembly, then this person is to be treated like a what? You remember what he said? Like a pagan or a tax collector. So the question that I'm wondering is, well, how are you supposed to treat an IRS agent? Be careful how you answer that one. Some of you know this, but in the New Testament of the Bible, there are 4 biographies on the life of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And remember that today we're reading in Matthew. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Is it a coincidence that Matthew is the only one of the 4 who records this conversation about the chairs? The 12 men that Jesus has recruited to be a part of his inner circle, the men that he would mentor for 3 years before turning these men out to start building the foundation for the future of the Jesus movement, these 12 were selected from a variety of backgrounds, experience, and occupations. 1/3 of the group were commercial fishermen, small business owners. One was a rebel who had dreams that someday they were going to drive the Romans out of Israel by force. We don't know about several of them, but Matthew, before he became a disciple, was a tax collector. How do you suppose he felt when he heard Jesus slam tax agents? Remember that Rome has been on a terrorist type takeover for decades. I've shown you this. Take a look. I've shown you this map many times. Rome ruled the entire rim of the Mediterranean Sea. And typically when Rome would flex their overwhelming military muscles and occupy a region with troops, if you lived in that territory, you became an instant slave to the Roman justice system and to their aggressive economic policies. Rome maintained a huge military, which requires a lot of money. They also built an elaborate highway system so that their troops could be moved and relocated at a moment's notice. Plus, they had stationed governors to oversee all the areas that they had conquered. All those things demanded a lot of money. So the best way to maintain economic dominance was what? Excessive taxes. And their tax codes were in the range of 75 to 80% of the income. And the money then was transferred to Rome to support the extravagant lifestyle of the emperor and his staff. The balance was used to support this enormous and efficient war machine. The Roman leaders were clever about how best to do this. So instead of sending their own tax agents in to do the dirty work, they would hire local citizens from each region to collect the tax revenues. These were men from your own village, possibly your next door neighbor. Maybe your kids played on the same soccer team. Tax collectors were compensated with whatever they could squeeze from their fellow citizens by any means necessary, and they were typically some of the richest people in the community. They were on a fast track toward financial wealth and security. So is it any surprise that these were some of the most hated people in your town? Well, Jesus not only endured a lot of criticism for spending time with tax collectors, these traitors, but remember that Jesus was devoted to, he never wanted to neglect a stray sheep. Because as he said on several occasions, nobody can predict when a lost person might decide to find their way back home. So Matthew, this former IRS agent, records the words of Jesus about the priority of the 2 chairs. When a relationship gets fractured, not just cracked, but shattered in 1,000 pieces, there's some things we can do that will make it worse. So Jesus looked around at his team and he said, whenever another believer does or says something to hurt you, grab 2 chairs. Resist the temptation to talk about the issues and the problems with 6 other people who can't make it better anyway. And don't bury your frustration, because if you do, it will most likely turn into anger. And that produces a crazy assortment of powerful negative emotions. And then one day those emotions will all get together and plan an insurrection and either explode in a destructive outrage or smolder inside your heart until your heart just implodes. My friends, refuse to reach for a shovel and dig a relational grave and put up a headstone to a relationship that is no longer. And then everybody loses. Care enough to get a couple of chairs. And when you're able to have a conversation with a bright light shining into whatever is broken between you, And then at least, maybe healing and restoration can have a chance. Several years ago, I stopped by a home of a couple that I had known for decades. This wife was in the final moments of her life. The only sound in the living room where her the hospice bed was set up was the hissing sound of some venting oxygen. And while I was there, me on one side of her bed, her husband on the other, this beautiful woman quietly just stopped breathing. Her husband of 50 plus years reached over and turned off the oxygen and said to me, "Guess she won't need that anymore." And then he looked across the bed at me, choking back his tears, and said, "Is she already in heaven?" And I said, "I'd bet my life on it." There were no crowds outside of her house. There were no big headlines or notices in the newspapers. No television announcements. No parades on the street out front of their house. But I said to this faithful and broken-hearted husband, it might be quiet in here, but on the other side, the trumpets are sounding, and she's being escorted into the only banquet room that matters, and the banner over the head table says, "Welcome home." Not because she was famous or great in the eyes of this world, but because she was forgiven. She was covered in amazing grace. And just a moment or two before that, Jesus said to her, "Take my hand. We'll walk together across the bridge." Making up is hard work. But for my old friends Wesley and Lewis, two brothers alienated by 17 years of bitter jealousy, it was worth it for them when they worked it out. It was a tearful day for Bill Buckner in 2008, 22 years after his most embarrassing moment of his great career, when the people of Boston greeted him with a hero's welcome and an ovation of forgiveness. When we do the hard work in the chairs and we stop the fighting, I wonder if maybe all of heaven responds with a standing ovation. What do you think?
Just one word, you calm the storm that surrounds me. Just one word, the darkness has to retreat. Just one touch, I feel the presence of heaven. Just one touch, my eyes were open to see. My heart can't help but believe. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a mountain that He can't move. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Just one word, you heal what's broken inside me. Just one word, and you revive every dream. Just one touch, I feel the power of heaven. And just one touch, my eyes were open to see. My heart can't help but believe. There's nothing that our God can't do. Not a mountain that He can't move. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a prison wall He can't break through. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. I will believe, I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. Let faith arise, let all agree. There's no power like the power of Jesus. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. Let faith arise, let all agree. There's no power like the power of Jesus. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. Let faith arise, let all agree. There's no power like the power. There's nothing that our God can do. There's not a mountain that He can move. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Oh, no. There's nothing that our God can't do. Not a prison wall He can't break through. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Oh. Thank you for joining us this week. So glad that you tuned in. Have a great week.
Hello, friends. Our prayer is that the worship music and the message has been an encouragement to you today. If there's anything that we can do to help you in your faith journey, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can do that in multiple ways, mostly through the website. Also, let me leave you with two things. First off, if you're new and you've been kind of checking things out here at St. Mark's Church online over the last few weeks, or maybe brand new today, we would love to get to know you. All you have to do is text the word new to 64600, and we would love to mail you a gift. We also have a team of really friendly folks that will just reach out to you and just see if there's any way we could do to serve you or pray for you. And finally, if you would like to give and support the ministries of St. Mark's Church, you can do that online as well. Just go to exploresmc.org/give, and we appreciate your generosity and your support of all of the ministries that are happening and continue to happen throughout the summer. Our prayer is that you've had a terrific holiday weekend as well as an amazing summer. God bless.
the darkness falls, it won't prevail. 'Cause the God I serve knows only how to triumph.